This show is for the climate community. Those who are aware of, engaged with, concerned about, basically doing anything about the climate crisis. It's not necessarily for podcast nerds. But if you're anything like me, the acronyms PRX or NHPR or NPR make you excited. And today, in this episode, I'm like a kid on Christmas morning because I got to speak to two people from NHPR, New Hampshire Public Radio, who work on a show called Outside In, distributed on PRX, the public radio exchange. And even better than talking to the people who make the stuff I listen to, they make a climate show, and a damn good one. In this episode, you're going to hear all about this new mini-series called Windfall, and of course, you're going to want to check it out. So please, find a link to Windfall, which is on the Outside In feed, right at the top of the show notes, and you're going to want to stick around for this whole hour of talking podcasts, climate, storytelling, and how we can engage with this new clean energy revolution that's happening around us, and that's finally happening in the US. And what we here in Australia and New Zealand can learn from it and apply. All right, settle in, headphones on, enjoy. Music in this episode is Time is a Flower Part 1, The Dream Refused to Stay the Same by Selfless Orchestra, and Town Market by Blue Dot Sessions. Hello and welcome to Climactic. Today we're thrilled to welcome two members of the US podcast community. I'm your host, as always, Mark. Let's get started.
There are dire warnings that New South Wales will be hit by increasingly extreme weather.
2015 was the hottest year since climate records began.
Your show this July was the single hottest month in recorded history.
Australia sweltered through its hottest spring on record.
Climate change is now affecting every country on every continent.
It's the rate that's of great concern.
And what do you put that rate down to?
Oh, it's human activity.
We have everything we need. Some still doubt that we have the will to act, but I say the will to act is itself a renewable resource.
Outside In is a show about the natural world and how we use it. It's a wonderful show and one I'll be diving into the rich catalog from in due course. Today we're talking a new 5-part series on Outside In with two of its creators. Jack Rodolico has spent his career in public radio and podcasting, producing narrative-driven investigative journalism that delivers an emotional impact. He's a recipient of more than a dozen local and national awards, including a National Edward R. Murrow Award, and finalist nods from the Scripps Howard Foundation and the DART Award for Excellence in Coverage of Trauma. Annie Ropeik is the Environment and Energy Reporter for New Hampshire Public Radio. Get used to the acronym NHPR now. She joined NHPR's reporting team in 2017, following stints with public radio stations and collaborations across the country. She's reported everywhere from fishing boats, island villages, and cargo terminals in Alaska, to cornfields, factories, and Superfund sites in the Midwest. Hello, both, and welcome to Climactic, the flagship podcast of an independent collective of podcasts from Australia and New Zealand engaging with climate change. And to get us started, I'd love to know kind of what Australia and New Zealand mean to the two of you. What's a favorite thing you've got from Australia and New Zealand? It could be high art, I was thinking before. It could be Rode microphones like the one I'm speaking into now. It could be the great documentary Mad Max. It's up to you. Jack, to get started?
This is the kind of question that you'll really show your ignorance. But the thing that comes to mind is Whale Rider. My wife introduced me to that movie years ago. Is that local?
So my mother, the reason I'm Kiwi and not just an American pretending to be Kiwi. My mom's Kiwi and from the East Cape, and from near. It still would have taken 4 hours by gravel roads to get to that village in the movie, but somewhat geographically close.
I love that movie. It feels like one of those timeless things, and I was introduced to it much later in life. It was like my wife's companion through her childhood, so I love it. That's the one. I'll say that.
Very good choice. Okay, Annie, that was a strong start from Jack.
Yeah, I haven't thought about Whale Rider in years. That's a great movie. I mean, I'm sure a lot of your American guests say this, but I associate New Zealand with Lord of the Rings, and would love to go and do that sort of tour sometime. I should also note that I've seen the band 5 Seconds of Summer several times in concert as a consequence of seeing One Direction in concert, but that's also Australian, so I'll give you that too.
One for each of us. That's perfect. Thank you very much. Cracking in here, I've actually got the trailer for Windfall teed up.
There is simply no reason why the blades for wind turbines can't be built in Pittsburgh instead of Beijing. No reason. None.
Right now, there are 7 offshore wind turbines spinning off the east coast of the United States. 7. But if everything goes according to plan, in less than 10 years, there could be thousands. The economics of climate change have shifted. Big money is pivoting away from fossil fuels, and it's often moving towards one solution in particular: offshore wind. Everything about offshore wind is big. The stakes are big.
Now to a dire warning about climate change.
The emotions are huge.
I'm asking you to be heroes here. Make a few sacrifices.
And the technology is enormous. These turbines are so big, they don't even really fit on land. Each is taller than the Washington Monument. In fact, offshore wind is so big, it's shaking up our ideas of who is breaking the Earth's climate and who is positioned to fix it. Because some of these giant corporations looking to capitalize on offshore wind, companies like BP and Shell, they are the same companies who arguably got us into this mess in the first place.
Like, I feel like you see these ads from BP that are like, BP means beyond petroleum, and I just want to throw up. But I guess we could think of it more in the sense of the renewable economy is the economy of the future.
After decades of politicization and red tape, America is about to witness the birth of an industry: offshore wind. And no matter how you might feel about it, this change is coming.
So what is it going to take to make you agree? And I said, there is no price.
I do not want to see one wind turbine in the water. Not one.
I'm calm and relaxed. It's not in my hands, but I'm so eager to get moving and actually start building.
This June, NHPR's award-winning podcast Outside In presents Windfall, a deep dive into a sea change on the horizon. Subscribe to Outside In wherever you get your podcasts, and look for episodes of Windfall to start dropping on June 24th. Learn more at windfallpodcast.org.
So I've heard the first 2 published episodes of the 5-part series that have been published as of the time of recording, 7th of July. And the first is about sort of the size of offshore wind, both the turbines and the number of turbines in the world and being installed in other places, and the size of the developments and how it's increasing, and why all those turbines have that familiar 3-blade design we can all picture. It was fantastic. And then the second episode is all about sort of the last 3 decades of legislation in the U.S., sort of illustrated through this one project in New England and its kind of powerful NIMBY dynamic that was happening there with Kennedy in opposition to the project, and sort of for a local comparison to New Zealand and Australia, that's like trying to install a wind farm in the northern beaches of Sydney or Bondi inside of Chris Hemsworth's house. It was very audacious. One thing I was noticing is, as I kind of wrote that bio of the first 2 episodes this morning, is I didn't mention the Native American artifact aspect, and there's this, in the second episode, a big aspect of it. So to bring you both in, and it's very timely for our listeners here, because in Australia it's the start of NAIDOC Week, which is the week of sort of Aboriginal, acknowledgement, and actually like talking about Australia in the context of Aboriginal culture and occupation, like life there for tens of thousands of years. So can I ask you both how it kind of felt for you personally, kind of talking about that aspect of the project and how you mentally, made space to include that in this otherwise, the wind conversation. But
Sure. On that story of Cape Wind, which for people who aren't familiar was supposed to be the first large scale, like a power plant of wind turbines, right, in the ocean in U.S. history, and it never happened. It took a decade and a half for it to never happen. It was such an ugly fight, but it got tremendous coverage, international coverage, because when it was first proposed, it was actually going to be the first offshore wind farm in the world, commercial utility scale. So it was a hot thing to cover. I mean, and it was interesting. And, you know, one of the things I did when digging into that story was I went back to the big local paper, the Boston Globe, and went back to the beginning of their coverage and read every story, basically, that they did for 17 years. And a bunch of other papers too, but primarily that one. And that was really striking because I did not see Native American, their issues with the wind farm covered very much at all. You know, there are some reasons for that because it was complicated. There was a lot of layers. However, like I won't give anybody a pass. Like it was a pretty big deal that two different Native American tribes both had very similar issues. You know, the big one being that essentially there was going to be an industrial wind park in the middle of where there were archaeological remains, where there believed archaeological remains of their people going back to the last ice age, right? So it was interesting and yet when I talked to people who really were close to Cape Wind, a couple of reporters who covered it, the opponents and the supporters, like, you know, people are really on the front lines. All of them said when I said, can you pick out like the 3-4 moments of this, you know, decade and a half that really stand out as game changers? Everybody to a person said when the federal government came out and said that the Wampanoag have a legit claim here, that this is, it was put on a list of historic places that should be preserved by the federal government. And so there was this spike in stories about it when that happened in 2010. But they didn't have a lot of nuance, and they tended to actually just cover it from the wrong angle, frankly, when we look back at what the substantive issue was. They actually focused on the photo op. They focused on the thing that was easy to cover, which was one of the regulators from the Obama administration came up to see the Wampanoag, and they had this sunrise ceremony where they stand on the beach and watch the sunrise. And it was kind of caricatured of like the bureaucrat and the Native Americans standing together going through the like quote ceremony, when in fact it was a legal issue. I mean, it was just like on the ground, this is potentially an archaeological site, don't build there, was the concern. So it honestly felt somewhat satisfying to like to go back and center their story. You know, it is a complicated story. There's a lot of angles. They were not the only reason that wind farm did not happen by a long shot. However, they were a pretty big part of it, and not arguably they were there first. So starting with them, made a lot of sense. So surprising, not surprising to see them sort of forgotten from the narrative in real time, written out of it. And yet it felt really important to give them the first word on this whole thing.
Annie, when it came to reporting out this project, were there any kind of lessons learned that, you know, will be applied to future projects on how to sort of look for the indigenous, the native angle to especially renewables or a climate story, and the way those are going to be addressed or centered in future stories?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important theme, and one I think I've been really happy with how we have centered just sort of equity and inclusion questions throughout the series. Like the indigenous angle comes up a lot in the Cape Wind episode, and then in subsequent episodes that'll be released soon, we just talk more about the idea of environmental racism generally, and what it looks like to try to ensure that communities that have been marginalized and have taken the brunt of pollution impacts in the past, how they can get a disproportionate benefit from those actions to correct those issues, to try to kind of balance those scales. So, I mean, I think it is just a, sort of skill I've had to train myself to do as a climate reporter in all kinds of stories, like from a minute-long newscast item to a huge project like this one. Is you have to be really intentional about centering that. And that's kind of something I've learned in talking to environmental justice scholars also, is like the whole point of correcting environmental racism is that intentionality and, just doing policies for like siting a wind farm or for distributing jobs, doing those sort of by the book and how they've always been. You know, in the States, like you're going to encounter a lot of systemic issues that have perpetuated the inequalities that we see in those spaces. And so being intentional about how you design those policies, how you design projects, and of course how you cover them as a journalist, you know, is a step in correcting that. So it's been a really good exercise, to try to keep it centered. And, you know, it would be so easy for this show to just be all white men. It's a very white man centered space. And so, so I was happy, to hear that Jack focused so much on the Wampanoag part of the narrative for the Cape Wind story, for sure.
The decision to kind of put these two stories together in this one episode, I thought it was such a deliberate, conscious, and even in my own retelling of it, I'm totally caught in the trap of like, I want to talk about the fact there's a Kennedy being talked about, and it's such the headline, attention-grabbing thing.
It's juicy.
Yeah, it's juicy. Everyone in the world knows the name Kennedy. And yet I love that it's very much talked about here, and then that classic NIMBY narrative is totally undercut by, so it is your backyard, Jack, or, you know, whatever I assume it was a Jack because it's a Kennedy, but whatever his first name was.
Ted.
It's a Ted and a Robert.
And a Robert,
yeah.
Sorry, the two Kennedys in the narrative. And that's totally undercut by like, yeah, sure, it's your backyard currently, but we're talking about the people who've lived here for millennia, for tens of thousands of years.
Yeah.
And it just really cuts them out at the knees, that NIMBY debate of like, okay, the reason you don't want it is you don't want it to affect your life and your kids and your legacy, but this is people talking about their ancestry and the lineage and culture and history and their entire way of seeing the world. Was that a really conscious thing of like, here's how we can kind of undercut the classic NIMBY narrative? Because we're all familiar with it.
Yeah, it really was. I think for one, it's always a challenge, a good kind. These are satisfying stories to do these sort of retrospective reports on something that is completely litigated, right, and done, because typically the people involved want to talk. You know, they don't have anything at stake anymore. The lawsuits are settled or eliminated. But it is tricky if you are not a person who like reported on it actively when it happened, to just figure out what even is important in this story. But so that's number one. So I think we really had to prove to ourselves like how big a part of the story was the Native American opposition to it, because it was just hard in retrospect was that in fact bigger than the opposition of the governor of the state it was in, the state's senior senator in, you know, that's a pretty big deal. But yes, it was very clear that it was very important. And also, I think that part of the deliberate decision comes in what you tell listeners first. You know, we really worked hard I think it's important to always work hard, and in this story in particular, to not say, you know, here's what we think you know about X. It could be about a politician, it could be about anybody, but in this story, well, here's what we think you know about Cape Wind. The assumption is, let's just assume people don't know anything about it. Or if they do, they have like a thing in there, like, oh, what was that? It was a wind farm? Like, somebody didn't like, you know, just people don't follow these things like insiders, you know. And so the way you frame, a lot of times the choice you make in structuring a story is like the first thing you tell them does frame it, you know. So I think you have to be careful about that, be confident in it, and also like really avoid tropes and, you know, cliches. And we wanted to challenge that narrative that it was just a NIMBY story, because even all of the people most closely involved, whether Native American, the guy who wanted to build the wind farm, the other locals who hated it, and the journalists, all of them said this was not a NIMBY story. And it was infuriating to have the national press come in and constantly say that it was more nuanced than that. So the decision is to find the voice you want to center first, to let that be the introduction to people. Is that fair? In this case, I think it was. And then a little later in, you can say, here's what the press said about all this, you know, but you kind of want to start with where the story actually starts Well, often, there's a lot of ways to tell a story, but in this instance, it felt like starting with the Wampanoag was true to the story and probably helpful to people who didn't know anything about it rather than put their head in the box of the cliches about the story.
One thing I would add on that I think is so interesting about the idea of how nuanced that situation actually was. I mean, we have the benefit of hindsight. I lived on Cape Cod sort of in the midst of Cape Wind when it was in very procedural steps and stories were it was in the phase, I think, that one of the reporters we talked to says where every day we would put out an update that says it might happen next year, that just kept going and going. It is hard to get that perspective on it. And this was, the way that the country was introduced to offshore wind. And that's part of why the story comes at the beginning. I mean, chronologically, but also when I've been covering wind in the Northeast just this year, as it's really been taking off, Cape Wind is very much still on people's minds, and the sort of the echoes of the NIMBY perception really have stuck around and tainted how the industry has continued to grow, how people think about it. So I think bringing that kind of nuance to it and helping people think more critically about how they get their opinions about a topic like this is really valuable, more so than just it is where the story starts, but it's also just a really interesting sort of parable in a lot of ways.
That's wonderful. Feel free in the course of this interview to really go into that, the thought behind how you structure the stories, how you tell these stories, because anyone who's listening to this episode, they're 100% going to be listening to Windfall. They're going to be hearing these stories themselves. I know that because they've heard that trailer, and that got me as soon as I heard it. I was like, this is brilliant. And that first episode, I really loved that this series started with this kind of meta episode where I know that there's a disclosure involved, which we'll talk about, and sort of the makeup of the team and what the team is going on to do. I just really loved this series was being talked about before you even heard it. And it was, not only setting it up through a teaser and a trailer, but this is I'm a podcaster. I like to geek out, and I got to kind of geek out with you guys in that episode and now with you live. So any of that sort of podcast geeking you want to do, feel free to let that come out. We'll make this a combination kind of transom episode and climate podcasting episode. So what was the goal for the series? And I'm I'm 2/5 of the way through. I'm really excited about where it goes from here. But in terms of the reportage and the, is it just, reporting, or is it sort of public education of how we got here? Or is it kind of advocacy for what comes next, or a blend of all three?
My impression of the series when I was on the outside of it, as it was sort of being reported for the first couple of years that it was going on, was kind of a deep dive into this particular project, Vineyard Wind, which is going on also in Massachusetts now. That's really the first project in the U.S. to kind of reach the construction stage. And as I began to work on the series, I realized it was about so much more really about the birth of the offshore wind industry in the country, why it took so long to get here, and the climate policy, economic, cultural, all the implications of just what it looks like to have a giant new economic sector like that be born, and how fraught that is. And I remember, Jack, there was a Post-it note or some note that someone found recently with a little outline of what the series was supposed to be about. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
No. What did it say?
I think one of our producers, Taylor, we can cut this part out if you want to. I'm going to go try to look while, Jack, you can talk about your
sure.
early thoughts about the series if you want.
Taylor Quimby's a name I know. I can't imagine him being a person
who
found a Post-it. Yeah.
A Taylor Quimby Post-it. We're going to sell it on eBay. So maybe I'll chat a little while you look that up, Annie.
Yeah, go for it.
Outside In a few years ago did a series on a power line. It was called Power Line. It's about a lot more than that, but it was about a huge hydropower project that was going to bring power from Canada into the United States. And it was a really layered story about sort of a topical news issue that was going on a lot. So it was a deep dive. But, energy stories are really important and really opaque. I mean, they are just so hard to understand, to make interesting, even though they are critically important. We're talking about where we get our electricity from. That affects your life a great deal on a day-to-day basis. And on top of that, climate change and this massive transition towards renewable energy, it's all really important. But it's opaque. It's hard to understand. It's certainly hard to tell a story about. But that's part of what Outside In does. So after the success of Powerline, our colleague who recently left, former colleague now, Sam Evans-Brown, he said he felt like the next thing to do if we're going to continue to do another series on energy was offshore wind, because it was clear that there was going to be a lot of offshore wind built very quickly in the United States. And so what Sam did was essentially like follow the first project in that pipeline over the course of a couple of years, gathered tape as he could. And then I came on board once he had done a great deal of the reporting. Annie came on a little bit after that. And the goal isn't really, it's certainly not to like advocate for a position. In terms of like climate change, that's not a debatable fact. It would take that as like concrete science, right? And so we're not advocating for renewable energy to be built and developed. We're reporting on the fact that it is being developed. And whatever you think about that, however you feel about that, almost kind of doesn't matter, hopefully. Like you can just listen to this and say, this is a massive new industry that's going to be created incredibly quickly in the United States. There are going to be winners. There are going to be losers. There are some really quirky and uniquely American political angles to how it's been politicized in ways that are actually quite surprising and don't fall along the typical lines of Democrats are for wind and Republicans are against it. I do that in air quotes. Ultimately it's about climate change. And I think part of the goal of the series was to tell a timely story about climate change that is actually focused on a solution. Again, it's not a judgment about that solution, but climate change is dire, and reporting on it is hard to read and listen to because of that. It's a pretty hard story. Not to say we shouldn't just because of that, but it felt kind of satisfying to have a climate story that felt like it was just more than that. It wasn't just looking at this awful thing. That is in the background, and that creates a lot of the stakes for the story. But ultimately, it's pretty much straight reporting through the lens of how do we tell this story in the way that hooks people the best? What's the way to unfold and unpack the concepts that are kind of esoteric, like, in a way that is actually sort of satisfying, and you get a sense of the people who are involved and maybe care about them no matter where they are in the see that they're human.
I found Taylor Quimby, who's our senior producer. You're the senior producer, Jack. Taylor is one of our amazing producers who does a lot of the mixing for the show and is a sound wizard. He sent us a picture of a note he found in a notebook from like an old an episode he did about veganism, like at least a couple of years ago, where him and Sam Evans-Brown, my co-hosts on the show, were brainstorming some sort of wind project, and they wrote, why here, why now, who benefits and who doesn't? Why here, why now, who benefits and who doesn't? And like, that's the frame pretty much. And then, I just on the climate change stakes, like, I think that's been something I've focused on a lot in the editing process, is just reminding people why this matters beyond, a lot of money and a lot of like jobs and physical, impacts to the ocean and to coastal communities. But beyond all of that, sort of the why you should care. And especially if you're not in one of those coastal communities, you're not getting one of those jobs, et cetera. I spoke with a climatologist, the state climatologist in Vermont, a few years ago, and she told me something that's really stuck with me for my sort of frame of how I cover climate change. And that was that you basically cover it from three angles, the whole conversation takes place in three ways, which is the causes of the problem, the impacts of the problem, and our strategies or the responses for dealing with it. And that she felt like the third one, the strategies, are what the media writ large really emphasizes the least, and that are what demands the most extra reporting. And so, yeah, I agree with Jack. It does feel really valuable and satisfying to do a deep dive on such a huge solution that is so hard to unpack, and that so many people have so many preconceptions about at such a crucial moment for it in this country especially.
Can I ask about the name? What does Windfall mean to both of you?
Hopefully a title does several things for you and leaves it a little open to interpretation. So I think it sort of suggests a windfall, right, is a huge benefit. Also, maybe just like some downstream effects, and I think that this is kind of a watershed moment where a lot will change really quickly. So it sort of implies money, it implies change, sort of implies a lot happening quickly, and that doesn't always work out great for everyone.
The suddenness of it, that's what I always get from it the most is, a lot happening at once, and a way that clearly benefits one party a great deal and maybe has some collateral damages, or at least just people who are caught up in it along the sidelines.
That's fantastic.
And that's a lot of what we talk about.
So I really loved your answer there around, as a station and as a team, once there's acknowledgement of climate change, this sort of reporting project on just an emerging industry is really depoliticized. Like, of course you'd cover it. It's like if, there was a new Silicon Valley opening in the Northeast, of course it would be covered. If there was just any kind of new industry, it deserves this kind of coverage. But I'm sure that there is, sometimes you want to kind of say more or go further than you potentially can within sort of your remit as a show and a production team within a public radio station. And maybe this is an opportunity to quickly talk about Sam and, Andy, your co-host, and the sort of the disclaimer at the start of the series about what he's going on to do. And why this is of particular interest to me is Climactic and the Climactic Collective are all independent shows that we can kind of very much do what we want, which means advocacy, and sort of, not have those bounds, which I think is counterproductive sometimes, because without any bounds, it's sort of hard to know what to do. If you don't know what to sort of butt up against, you're not sure how far to go sometimes. Can we talk about that sort of disclaimer where Sam is going, has gone at the end of this Windfall series, and why we're not going to hear his dulcet tones on Outside In anymore?
So Sam Evans-Brown was, I think we're calling him the founding host of Outside In. I actually applied for like a founding job on the podcast when I was a baby reporter, like years ago when it first started, and it was just Sam like making it happen at NHPR. He had glasses and he didn't have his babies yet, but it was just Sam. And years later, it's very bittersweet to say goodbye to him. I mean, he really created something fantastic here with an amazing team who will continue to make the show. It might sound a little different, but it'll still keep going. But yeah, Sam is going to go be a clean energy advocate. He's going to go work for an advocacy group. It was unfortunate timing for Sam. It kind of came about really late in the process. It sort of fell in his lap, just literally like a matter of weeks ago, and moved really quickly. He had hoped to be able to stay through the end of our production for the series and the end of it coming out, and obviously separate that from his new job. But we've had to sort of make some choices about, and that was part of why I came on as a co-host, was to basically provide an extra journalistic voice for the show, an outside perspective to make sure that it was airtight in terms of any bias, fairness, that there was nothing creeping in that could impugn the show, kind of given what Sam's going on to do, and just to sort of like break that binary down. I mean, the way we've been thinking about the difference between journalism and advocacy in this context is that a journalist presents the relevant facts and arguments about a topic or a story. They may talk about a topic in a certain way, or like in a certain, relative to a certain other topic. That would be an angle. And they let you, as the listener, decide what you think about everything that you were just told. Whereas an advocate is being paid to tell you to think a certain thing about it, to support a certain argument or outcome of that topic. And that's what Sam is going on to do, likely including offshore wind. So we wanted to make sure that was not going to color the show at all. Sam's a professional. I think left to his own devices, like, he would have felt fine about it, but we wanted to be really transparent with our listeners and how we had handled it. We hired an outside fact checker, brought me in. We've had tons of extra editors on the show, and have that disclaimer that runs with the episodes and is on the podcast feed. Sam is not going to, have his hands on it anymore. Certainly once he starts his new job, and he pretty much doesn't have his hands on it now that he has left NHPR. We might have him come in and record a couple extra things, but he's out of the mix editorially. And yeah, I mean, that was important to us to just make clear, because we do think of this as journalism and not advocacy. Outside In, relative to what I do in our newsroom, I think is more like commentary, but is still not hard advocacy. It may not be hard news, but so for example, I worked on an episode of Outside In with Sam a year and a half or so ago about the Republican politics of climate change, kind of through the lens of this important family in New Hampshire state politics who have all sort of had different roles to play in the story of Republican climate politics in interesting ways. And there were things as we were scripting it that like Sam would give to me to say or not, depending on just like a little bit how commentary-ish that they were, or if it was a little bit like Sam was kind of making a judgment call about, or some, something a little flip, maybe even about like our current governor. He would put that in his part of the script instead of mine. So there was already a little bit of a difference there, but it's just kind of continued in this context and, allowed me to work on the show, which I'm happy about.
That's really interesting to see how that dynamic develops over time, sort of as a host, how open you can be with what you think and how much of that you bring to what you put on the mic is very interesting. And there's definitely a whole episode in that, how you walk that line and who it is for each person. Let's jump over to you, Jack, and sort of with you sort of seeing how the project developed over time. A devil's advocate question with this series about offshore wind. Could you have seen NHPR getting behind a 5-part series on the nuclear industry? And I'm sure someone else has asked that before, but like, I'm kind of interested in like, there's a lot I don't know about the industry. There's a lot of facts and myths and suppositions, and potentially it's going to grow, although it definitely seems more dubious than offshore wind. So maybe the answer is just no. But how do you respond to that question?
I think anything is possible, and that is actually something that came up recently. Like, not in a like a way that we're planning or anything like that, but if in theory, this is very speculative, I'm not speaking for the institution, right, or the people I work with, but like, let's say, it makes sense to do a series on energy every few years, and like, that there's a narrative somewhere that's like a good story, a good yarn you can hold on to that's actually going to teach people something. Sure, nuclear. Yeah. I mean, I have a lot of questions about like nuclear seems, I know nothing, like I don't know much of anything about it, but as a reporter, I am really curious because there's clearly a tension between the fact that it is, right, like Annie would know this better than me, but it's not a fossil fuel. You're not contributing to climate change. It's a potential solution sitting right there. However, it's got quite a history that would make anybody pretty nervous. So that's tension, and that's stakes. And I think that's one of the things I always look for. And a lot of I'm not unique in this way. Reporters look for in a story. It's especially in this format, in this multi-episode narrative podcast space, that's journalism and based on real stories. You got to have something much bigger at stake than the lives of the individuals who are impacted. Even if those stakes are huge for them, it's typically got to feel like it means something much bigger. So, sure, we could do. Yeah, I mean, there's. I don't know enough about it, but it's something that is totally worth exploring, and I could see that happening in theory. There would be no barrier to looking into it and trying to figure out if there was a story.
I guess to me that just illustrates that the team did this as an act of journalism and investigative reporting, and it wasn't we really like wind, and that's why we're doing this 5-part series about it. No, because there was a story there. There is a yarn, like I said, and you wanted to tell it. Taylor's post-it is absolutely perfect of just, where is it? Where's it going? Who's going to benefit? That's beautiful. Can I ask about sort of the people who are doing good work in this space, the other people who are telling good yarns in the climate space? Who do you kind of look at as doing a good job? And I'm kind of curious if you kind of tend to look at more the PRX, the work that NHPR is doing, as well as, other sort of the NPRs of the world as well. Are you trying to sort of apply the best of podcasting and audio storytelling to the climate space, or is there anyone within the climate space who you kind of think is doing a pretty good, innovative, pushing the space forward job?
Yeah, I appreciate the question, because I feel like part of why I think that this series has worked is that it's not a super, like compared to the true crime, podcast industrial complex, like there isn't as much audio journalism about climate change, and there, even as much as there should be so much more. And so, I always think of big shows like How to Save a Planet from Gimlet. Outside In was an early player in that space, but I'm happy to see some non-audio first outlets starting to use audio more as a medium to tell this story. Grist, which is a really great nonprofit news site, just did a project recently where they had 6, basically it was oral history, so like 6 voices from very climate affected states in the US, Alaska, Louisiana. There was a West Virginia person in there about sea level rise, just telling their stories. And that's a format that I'm really interested in, would love to see more of, just collecting the voices of people on the front lines of climate change and presenting them in kind of that, science policy context that an outlet like Grist is already doing. I think that's really smart. And I think we're also just starting to see more public radio stations devoting more resources to this, and NPR, our sort of mothership, is devoting more resources to it as well. I've been doing some work with some of my counterparts in the network on wildfire risk in places like outside of California. That is kind of multimedia, and it's excited to see people sort of being more creative with how they start to try to tell the story in like short and long formats, because that's how you reach a broader audience and get people to realize it's already happening, which is really important.
Yeah, thank you for those couple of examples there. Just before I go to you, Jack, on sort of, what is interesting in this space to you. But I was thinking about it this morning, and I thought I've got a little bit of a confession to make to the two of you, that I've been listening to podcasts since I was like 12, and it was, political talk radio before that and books on tape, and I'm just raised by audio kid. And when I got concerned about climate a few years ago and couldn't find much sort of climate-engaged audio, finding Outside In and being very excited about How to Save a Planet, starting my own things, I couldn't find anything in Australia, talking to normal people. I thought I was going to feel much better once I had more content about this to consume. And in reality, the last week has been really hard for me on the climate anxiety and climate grief front, with seeing the heat dome in the Pacific Northwest, and the floods here in New Zealand, and just the list goes on. And I thought, it doesn't actually feel better that everyone's talking about it now. It just feels so undeniable and present that it's now unescapable for more people. So I guess maybe to throw to you, Jack, you work in the audio space. You're amazingly accomplished in the audio space. What do you... Sorry.
Did you hear that?
Yeah.
That's my son.
Goat?
I told you.
Kid goat?
Kid goat, yeah.
Yeah. I guess climate and audio. What are your thoughts on sort of that intersection? Where's it at? Where's it going?
I'm trying to answer your question as honestly as possible without sounding snarky. I can't name a narrative podcast about climate. And it's not because there's none out there. There could be some, but there's none that I know of. If there are, I'd love to hear them, like, for sure. As my listening habits go, I almost exclusively listen to narrative, like kind of chapter by chapter stories. And there's, it's not really limited by topic. Like I think that's the point with these, that's what Serial, right, taught everybody is like, one guy's story, whether or not he was actually guilty or not, is fascinating. You don't have to live in Baltimore. You don't have to have stakes in his case. There's something bigger about the story. So that's what I tend to listen to. And so and there's a ton of stuff out there. This last week I found The Vanishing of Harry Pace by Radiolab, which is fascinating. I would say I learned as much about how to tell a story about climate change from something like that as from anything, because it's really just about how to tell a good story. Like, oh, wow, listen to how they framed the problem that they had to deal with. Or, oh, it's interesting that they held that information back until episode 2 or 3, right? Yeah, and I know that there are a lot of talk shows about climate change. I personally just don't have much patience for talk shows. It's just not like, there's a couple I like, but not that much. It's just like the way my brain works these days. It's not what I'm too interested in listening to. So,
totally fair. Yeah, that's one thing in America. You don't get enough exposure to pundits and opinion and commentary, right?
Yes, that's right.
One thing that just reminded me of, Jack, the idea that like you can learn as much about how to tell a climate story from a Radiolab series. I totally agree with that. I've found that I'm even learning a lot about how to do my news work from our work on Windfall, just in how to pace things and set stakes and that kind of stuff. But I feel like there's so much good nonfiction in the climate space. Seminal recent books like Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Colbert and Water Will Come by, oh God, I'm going to get it wrong, Jeff Goodell, is that right? And Naomi Klein, and just like all of the big names, but like so many of those things work so well as a narrative podcast. Like the Sixth Extinction book is made to be a podcast, and like it would be great to hear more of that. It is a super resource intensive ask, though. I mean, it is incredible the amount of work that's gone into this show just in the past few months that I've been involved of editing it, let alone 2.5 years of reporting. And they were supposed to go overseas, and like all of the freelancers and fact checkers and editors that go into the credits. I mean, it takes a lot of time and money. I didn't mean for this to be like a plug to, donate to your favorite audio outlets, but like it really is the kind of work that takes resources that don't currently exist or are going into other spaces, and it would be great to spread some of that wealth.
You can't talk about great work without acknowledging what it takes to get it made. So I appreciate you did do that. Last night I got about a third of the way through Bomber Mafia, Malcolm Gladwell's new book, which is fantastic because it's sort of audio first, and especially the audiobook format. There's tape with his interviewees for the book, and there's some archival grabs, and it's wonderful. And I'm like, Malcolm should absolutely do a climate book, but Naomi Klein and all these amazing authors should also be having these amazing audio adaptations. But it's resource intensive, but I'd like to think there's an audience out there for it. Those are some really, really good thoughts. I really appreciate you both saying that very much. It's cool to hear what the people I listen to. It's nice. So climate's been called the third rail in especially the U.S. media context, and I'm just curious if you agree with that, or if you think that's sort of changed, and if there's still any kind of threat or danger in it. I guess it really depends on your circumstances and where you're working and your own context. But how dangerous does talking about climate feel in 2021 in the media world that you move through?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean by dangerous.
Dangerous in the sense that if you broach the topic of climate, will you lose credibility, be seen as an advocate, not be able to be seen as a serious journalist?
I think the thing is, I can't think of many topics in the United States that are not third rails at this point. Politics are so divisive, issues are so divisive. So that doesn't really, I don't think we think of an audience as per se like liberal or conservative or Democrat or Republican. And we definitely are conscious to not make specific editorial choices about a sentence, a paragraph in those terms either. Like, will we scare certain people away? The cliche is like a good story should piss people off on both ends, because that's not a goal or something. But sometimes I have felt this way myself, and I've talked to plenty of colleagues who say like, well, the people on this extreme end of this issue didn't like it, and the people on this extreme end of this issue didn't like it, so I probably did something right. And, again, not a goal, but sometimes a sign that, like, you kind of did a fair job of something that is divisive. I think that's what I think that's the goal with climate and anything else is you got to be fair to the facts and to the people who experience it. Yeah, the Cape Wind episode 2 of the show, my mom listened to it and said that it left her feeling ambivalent about the Cape Wind saga, which we all took as a great compliment because it's a really hard needle to thread. And that I agree, though. I mean, I think in climate change journalism especially, you do want to kind of strive for that, getting angry emails from both sides, because there's no way to do it that doesn't get you angry emails from one side or the other. And it is a topic that can sort of earn you a reputation for advocacy in certain circles, but then in others it will earn you a reputation for, never going far enough to tell the story. And I think that in really just the past 18 months or so, it kind of coincides with COVID, but I remember even in the 2020 US election cycle, so dating back into 2019, especially here in New Hampshire where we're in primary mode for, basically the other 3 years of every election cycle, there were starting to be just little changes that were bringing it more to the fore of the conversation. I mean, we had a confluence of politicians were here. There was a new crop of young voters who were bird dogging about climate change and really cared about it and were coming to these candidates' events and talking about it. I remember focusing on this theme a lot in fall 2019, that we were starting to talk about climate change in new ways. The huge fires in Australia happened around that time. And I remember at the beginning of one of the CNN presidential debates, they were doing live updates of those fires during the debate, which just felt totally new and unheard of for climate journalism to be that sort of front and center. So I think that it is still incredibly divisive, but it's also something has changed in the past couple of years where it's more normal to talk about it. It's not niche anymore. Maybe it's still a little bit niche in TV journalism in the States, I would say. You are not hearing them say the words, I think, as often as you are in newspapers and radio and digital media. But the dominoes are continuing to fall, and the idea of what objectivity means for climate change has completely shifted for the better, in a way that allows us to say facts like climate change is real, it's happening, etc., with journalistic certitude in a way that I couldn't 3 years ago. I mean, I did, but I would have to defend them really actively to our audience, and it just they don't ask about it anymore. There's a couple, the core group of denialists will still ask about it, but you don't have to think about them as much anymore. It's sort of become acceptable.
Yeah, that has less power than it used to.
Yeah, which is gratifying and encouraging. So that shift is still happening, but it's good, I think.
As you're saying that, Annie, what occurred to me is bringing it back to Windfall, to this podcast series. Climate change in this series is kind of I think that's one of the good things about covering offshore wind in this way is it's not a change that's relying on Congress passing a law. It's, and so it's just happening because the economics work.
Thank you both so much for your time. This has been extremely illuminating for me. Great to geek out about podcasting and, yes, not have sort of climate be the be-all and end-all of this chat with you on a climate show for climate-engaged people. This is just, it's a chat about a really awesome mini-series. I'm so excited that I can listen to something of Radiolab quality about what's actually happening on this planet. It's extremely validating, I'd say. Thank you both so much for coming on, for all your work on this series, and for what's coming out next. I can't wait to the next 3 episodes and to finish up Windfall and look forward to the next multi-year reporting project. All right, I'll stop it there. It was my huge pleasure to have Jack and Annie on Climactic. And I want to say a big thank you to Jeff Umbro from the Podglomerate for reaching out to me and booking this interview. The fact that this came to me is mind-blowing. And I want to thank you, each and every one of you listening, for making this show a platform that was worth Jack and Annie's time to come on and talk about Windfall. There's going to be some changes to Climactic soon as the collective pivots into a proper podcast network. And soon there's going to be things like a listener survey, as we become a bit more professional, a bit more official, a bit more grown up. So I just wanted to give you a super early heads up about that. And also, if you've got any experience in running listener surveys for a podcast, I'd love your advice. Reach me at hello@climactic.fm. Also, if you have any questions about this episode or any previous episodes, any critique or comments or advice, I'd love to get them. All right, thanks as always. And wherever you're listening in the world, stay safe and take care of each other in these climactic times. The Climactic Collective.